That's okay. Is it recording? Okay, I guess it is recording. I hit the red button. Now it's red. All right. It's recording.
Yay.
You're on film, so anything you do or say can be used against you as well. Deny everything.
They're recording what we said.
It's my advice to you is deny everything. But yeah, no, just be as natural as possible. You don't have to act. I was just kidding. Just, be on good behavior. All right, let's begin. So today, basically, there's 3 objectives to today's lesson. The first is we're going to understand the role of the media. Okay, so I'm going to go through just different theories that explains really what the principal objective of a media is. Particularly its relationship to a market economy. It serves a different purpose than, let's say, a command economy. So we're going to go through the first one. The second one, we're going to define what a bias is. So if we're going to talk about media biases, it's probably a good idea to actually define what we're talking about. So we're going to look at bias. But then we're also going to look at ideology. Because when we're talking about media biases, usually we're referring to an ideological bias, right? Like a left-wing bias, a liberal bias, a conservative bias, etc. So when you're doing your group projects, you'll notice that each station, or the station that you've been selected to do, will have a very strong ideological bias. Okay? And so we're going to talk about that. And then 3, we're going to read this excerpt from a textbook that some of you might know, maybe not. It's called Irony of Democracy. And we're going to look at sort of the media biases and the media as an elite group. Then once we're finished that, you'll break into your groups and finish your group project. Cool?
Yeah.
Any questions?
Nope.
Okay, let's begin. The role of the media. Anybody here has seen Manufacturing Consent?
What?
Noam Chomsky. He wrote a book. There's a documentary. He wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent. Right? And basically what he argues, and if you take media studies, you'll definitely study Chomsky. I think if you take any social science class, you'll study Chomsky, whether you disagree with him or not. But in media studies, manufacturing consent is often used as a beginner text because what he argues in that is that the role of the media is essentially shaped by the economy in which it operates. Right? So if we look at capitalism in general, what's the role of any institution or business institution in capitalism? What's the role?
Make money. Profit.
Okay, so to make profit and to make money, correct? But if you look at the media, is there any different role that they have?
Proselytize the people.
Okay, yeah?
Advertisements.
Okay, advertising. Okay, so they do show advertising. Now, why would they show advertising?
To make money.
To make money, right? So then what is the principal objective then of a media institution?
Making money.
Okay, making money, but do you agree with that? Or
Informing the people in the most neutral way possible.
Oh, yeah.
okay,
Yeah, neutral.
I mean, ultimately that's what, that's generally what we think the media should be doing. And I'm not trying to discredit all media institutions, but one of the problems, and this is what Chomsky points out in his book, and something I happen to agree with, but you don't have to accept this, is that actually the goal of the media, like CNN or Fox News, they are selling an audience. Okay, they're not there to provide a service. They're actually selling a product, right? They're selling an audience. They're selling you, your attention. Right? Your time is being sold by media companies to other companies so they can advertise. Okay? So when Colgate toothpaste or Pfizer corporation, right, wants to advertise a product, they're going to pick news stations that have the most amount of viewers. Right? And then the news stations with the most amount of viewers can charge the most amount of money to these corporations. Right? And so one of the main functions then really is for the media is to actually turn a profit. And how do they do that? Is by attracting an audience, right? Making you stick to the TV channel that you originally watched, right? Not to change the channel. Okay? Now, that can be seen as something critical, like negative, or it could be seen as something positive. Okay? I don't want you to take this as a complete. I mean, Chomsky largely criticizes that role, saying that because of this, the media is completely influenced by and owned by corporations. So it's not surprising that when you watch the media, it's more theater than it is actual news. Right? And if you look at even like Jon Stewart, who plays the role of political satire, he often criticizes Fox News and CNN for being theoretical, or theatrical, sorry, not theoretical. All right, so that in fact what you're watching is sort of drama, it's like a soap opera, masked with some issues that are important to our lives, okay? But on the other hand, can you think of how this drive to attract an audience could be positive?
People would look for the most neutral news station, so news stations have an incentive to be neutral as possible.
Exactly, so there is an incentive, not even an incentive, but I mean, there's really, if you're gonna sell an audience, you have to give something to the audience, right, to keep them watching, right? So really, the choice is up to you, what's on TV. If you like to watch, sports, right, then you're gonna watch sports, and by definition, or just because of the incentive, you're gonna have companies offering more sports channels, right? If you look at newspapers, for example, one of the biggest sections in a newspaper would be the sports section. And there's a reason for that. People like to read about sports, right? Yes?
But is it a good way of movement that the media is focusing much more on the things that people want to see? Like, I mean, wouldn't that lead to the newspaper kind of being like an advertisement of pop culture or something similar? Like only giving out the spicy stuff, not the actual things that people should know about?
Not the actual
Because
content.
like many people find politics boring, right? So
Yeah, that's right.
in that case, that wouldn't be the things that the media is delivering. So
Yeah.
People find it boring. Why should we force them to watch like sports and things that they don't want to learn about? If you force news stations to broadcast topics that no one will hear, they'll just turn it off.
So you're stuck with this kind of dilemma, right? But then again, when they are presenting political issues, they do have a responsibility of presenting it in such a way that's supposed to be informative, not necessarily theatrical, right? But then again, you can't force people to watch the program, right? So it has to be interesting. And how do you make it interesting?
Theatrical.
Yeah, theatrics, right? You get someone who wears a bow tie and 38 years old. Tucker Carlson, okay. Or you get someone who has a very loud voice and yells at people who comes on the show, Bill O'Reilly. Okay. No, but it's true, and they even would admit it that they're opinionated shows, although they admit that their station is not opinionated, that it's not biased. Okay, so we have this role of the media. We sort of have, on the one hand, it has to capture the interest of the audience. On the other hand, we do have sort of an expectation of the media to provide the citizens with some type of valid information, a valid source, right? But it's a trade-off for these companies, right? So they have to do a bit of both. Now, in Korea, what kind of news stations do you watch in Korea? What are the popular ones?
SBS.
Blah. KBS?
There's three major broadcasters.
NBC.
Channels.
KBS?
Yeah.
Korean broadcaster.
wait, does it have to be like broadcast, like media, like not things like newspapers?
Just TV. Or actually media.
NBC.
Any media is fine.
SBS.
SBS?
SBS.
NBC.
NBC. And then there's a channel where it only
M,
broadcasts
M,
only news.
Really?
YTN.
YTN?
Not N, M.
Which one?
M.
Third one. Third one, M.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's an M.
Yeah, whatever.
Sure, why not? It's an M. Alright, the fourth one is YTN.
Yeah, that's the channel where it broadcasts only
Your
news.
True Network.
Your True Network. And this is only news. This is 24-hour news.
Yeah.
YTN is like the AP
Okay?
in the United States.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, YTN.
Got it. Okay, interesting. Alright, do you know the biases of these?
No.
Yes.
Government.
Yes.
Pro-government usually.
All of them?
Yeah.
No,
the mainstream.
NBC definitely.
KBS is run
Okay.
by the government, so
We should add like the more skewed ones, like TV Joseon is skewed towards the conservative. NBN is
Joseon.
also
JTBC.
pro-conservative.
Okay.
But
BBC
the
is
major,
like
pro-liberal.
Pro-liberal?
the major broadcasting stations
Yeah.
are like the top three. KBS, SBS, and NBC are focused more on the government.
No, they're not.
They are.
No, they're not.
They are.
Are they, or they're not?
NBC is very disputable because they have a history of being pro-liberal.
Okay.
But KBS is run by the government.
Yeah, so it's
all
very-
It's run by the government. Okay.
There is a mandatory fee you need to pay to maintain KBS. And your taxes.
Interesting. But yeah, so the role of the media is often conflicted with what it's supposed to do, or at least what we think it's supposed to do, right? But sometimes it's not conflicted, right? And so we have to sort of filter out, what's overly biased information, right, from the actual information itself, right? And that's kind of the tools I'm trying to set up with this lesson for this week and next week. All right. The second thing I want to get into today is actually defining a bias and ideology. Now, most of you know what a bias actually is, but just to clarify, if I said that you are being overly biased in your opinion, what does that mean?
It means you're
I'm
prejudiced
prejudiced.
to one opinion.
All right, that you are somehow.
One-sided.
You're
Opinion
leaving
toward
out
opinion
facts
side.
that would be detrimental to your cause in order to further your own.
Okay, so if we look at bias, right, to be biased, one is selective information.
Subjective viewpoint.
The two would be subjective, okay, in the sense that you're touting an opinion as opposed to a political fact. Okay? But perhaps you are presenting it as fact, right? So it especially when we watch the news, the way it's set up is that we assume it to be largely objective. Just if you look at most news stations, they all look the same. They have the same interface on the front. They have the bottom screen with all those numbers and news stories coming in, and you have different anchors with different ideas, and you have the weatherman coming on, or woman. You have different sort of logos at the top, and sometimes the screen is smaller, but they all fundamentally look the same. And that's a process is called social legitimization. And all that means is that in order for an institution to be valid, right, they have to all look similar, right? And banks, for example, they all look the same. If you went into a bank and it looked like McDonald's, would you go to that bank? Maybe not, right? But why not? Because we associate banks. Exactly, it doesn't seem professional. But that's only created by the standard structure of what banks look like. Now for the news, it's the same thing. Is that all the news companies, they look the same, especially when you watch their interface, how their display screens are up. And so we automatically associate that interface with information, even though it might be completely biased and it can be mostly theater. Okay? And so they use that as a tool. But that's a way of presenting something that's subjective, but presenting it as objective, right? And they use the sort of standard model, right, the standard interface to project themselves as being objective, even though perhaps they're not being so. All right? Now, of course, there's different degrees of bias, right? I don't think anyone could say that any news station is 100% neutral. That would be difficult because there's always information that you're going to leave out. You can't possibly include every piece of information that's relevant to the story, otherwise the story is never going to end, like the movie Never Ending Story. Right? Which, when I went to see that movie, I was very surprised at it. And
Oh my god.
I brought, my life supplies there, everything. I just thought I'd never leave. This is great. $15, I get a theater as a house, perfect.
You know it's gonna record it, right?
I told you it should be very natural.
Maybe too
So we
natural.
didn't laugh.
Okay, yeah, none of you laughed all that much. All right, so it's subjective in the sense that it presents itself as being objective, even though it's presenting opinions. Anything else that would sort of clarify that something is being overly biased? Like, how can you distinguish, let's say, one program that's the 6 p.m. news versus on CNN versus Fox News 6 p.m. How would you distinguish? How do you know that both of them have a different bias?
The statements and diction they use are much more normative.
Okay.
They try to make decisions or messages.
All right.
For instance, when they deliver some kind of information about how there was food poisoning in certain products,
Mhm.
it's kind of opinionated.
Okay.
That's direction.
also like the type sources of information. For example, if you interview some kind of protesters, then they're trying to be pro-liberal or like, against government. Or if you interview like some kind guy in the like for police stand against protesters and how get they beaten by the protesters.
Okay.
This media is trying to say how it's against protesters.
And that's electoral consideration.
That's right. And so, well, that's a good point. Who they interview is actually also a really good point. And that, I think that would go under selective information, is that you have to look at who they interview, who they have come on the show. And so oftentimes, if it's an incredibly biased show, you'll see that they'll invite two people with opposing opinions, but the broadcasting station will favor one of those individuals, and it'll become very apparent. If you watch like Fox News, for example, and I use Fox News because it's just the easiest one to pick on. If you look at when they interview people like Richard Dawkins, for example, or the late Christopher Hitchens, who are atheists, or currently atheists, when they go on that show, which is largely Christian-based, I mean, at least that's the narrative they project, those guys are seen as crazy, crackpots, they're the ones that are religious, right? And so they often portray that in a very strong manner, which can be confusing to the general public because when we see the news, we think objective, right, analysis, right? So it can be misleading.
Mr. Mesaros, one more thing. It's how they frame the issue.
Okay.
Because if something comes up, usually you say this is because of something, this is because of something. And Fox News, like if there's an economic problem, it's like, oh, that's Obama's fault. And then if there's something good, it's like, oh, that's the people. So it's like how you attribute the causes.
That's right. How do you frame an issue? Right. So if you look at the Benghazi situation, right, that was seen as complete incompetence, by the Obama administration. Right. And it was projected as a complete failure of the Obama administration. But actually, that was not portrayed. That incident was not portrayed in the same degree on other news stations. So Fox News made it out to be a failure of the Obama administration to protect its embassies around the world and protect its foreign service workers. But other news stations, although they covered it, it wasn't such a main issue. It wasn't seen as a huge failure because there are hundreds of embassies around the world, hundreds of foreign workers all over the place. It's practically impossible, no matter how hard the government tries, to protect everyone. But there was allegations that they kind of knew what was going to happen, and there was allegations towards how the investigation was carried out. Was it carried out effectively, etc. And so, in that case, you kind of have, you can tell if a station is biased depending on how they view the current president, right? So if you know the president is a Democrat, which is the current situation, if the news station is very critical of them, you get the feeling that perhaps maybe they're more biased, right? If you have a Republican in power, but the same station seems to be more in favor of it, then you clearly know that perhaps this is also bias as well. The last thing I want to leave you with in terms of bias before we move on to ideology, are biases necessarily a bad thing?
No.
I mean, I'm talking as if it's biased and it seems like I'm picking on Fox News, but is it actually, a bias is essentially, we call it a narrative. It's a particular viewpoint that speaks to a certain audience. It's a particular point of view. It's a particular framework of how to view the news. So, how would a bias be good?
I think that bias itself is not necessarily a good thing when it's like dominating. For example, it's like a monopoly of one media that's only showing biased information to the people. Like the people are kind of taking away their right to know about everything. And then when there are multiple biases that are open towards the people so that the people can see what opinion and what not, I think that there's not much of a problem. Just like how there are many products in the market.
That's what Fox News said.
Yeah.
As long as there's something to counter that, obviously you're the one making the decision.
That's right.
As long as everything is right in front of you for you to decide, then I think it's okay. But then if that's not the case, then bias is obviously a problem.
Okay.
I think the bias can be okay in certain situations, when, for example, emergency. For example, when North Korea attacks Korea, but if one media says that it's all fake and it's made by the government, then we all have to be like patriotic feelings against North Korea, and we have to be like united. But media's bias against governments or like some kind of issue can really divide the public opinion.
Okay.
So like in certain situations, I mean, the bias is really dangerous, and it's really, sometimes it's really.
Okay, interesting. I've heard that criticism of the media before, sort of dividing the public, making issues seem very black and white. All right, good. Anything else?
Scratching my head.
Oh, okay.
Well, I think bias can be a problem when, like, if they present it as if it's an objective opinion or objective fact, but like in truth, they have selective information and they have subjective views about stuff. But if they present it as if it's objective, I think that becomes a problem.
That's right.
Because like people can have wrong thoughts and wrong viewpoints about some.
They can't distinguish it.
Yeah.
Right. Which becomes a problem because if that's your source of information, and you don't know how to distinguish between bias and fact, that's pretty. That can be pretty influential in your own political thought, which can be pretty scary. I mean, I guess the issue I have with bias is that, I mean, it's the idea that the news is supposed to, sort of contribute to the political discourse, right? So some bias is obviously, involved in that process. But when you present an extreme bias, and you frame issues in a certain way without being honest to the viewers, when you have slogans like fair and balanced, yet at the same time you constantly criticize the president for things that you would never criticize if that president was Republican, this is no particular network that I have in mind, then there's a problem because now you're misleading the public. You might as well just come out and say that yes, we are a news network, we provide a certain narrative, we're trying to get our viewpoint across. We think this viewpoint is valid, and we have, we're not apologizing for it. If you want to watch it, watch it. If you don't, go watch something else. I think that would be a better attitude than trying to pretend like everything is, fair and equal, and we live in this sort of equal, pluralistic society.
Yeah, but then I guess it's hard for media to do that because they are, as Chomsky said, like basically a business that sells. Audience, so they don't want to lose half of their audiences, maybe.
That's right,
They
because
can't
if
report anymore.
because if one news network does it and the other ones don't,
Yeah.
that's going to be a problem, right?
Game theory.
Yeah, it's game theory. They all have to do it at the same time, pretty much, right?
Isn't bias able to attract more people? Because every news station is neutral, and people won't be as interested as the biased news station. And
Yeah, what's the need of the
yeah,
news
but they
stations?
will be able to know more about the fact, even though it's biased. So knowing nothing at all is worse than knowing a biased opinion, I thought. So.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, at least it's some information being presented to the public. Absolutely. It might be one-sided, but still at least they're being aware of a particular issue.
I mean, as long as it's not fabrication, then sure.
That's right,
It
yeah.
is information.
Yeah, I mean, and there is the whole, I don't know what they have in the U.S., some big amendment, it's called the first one. What is that amendment again? What right to, what is it, freedom of what? Talking?
We have U.S. history.
Ah, yes,
To
freedom of
us.
speech, right? So the media has the right to freedom of speech. They have a right to express the narrative, as long as they're not fabricating information, as long as they're not downright lies. And if they are lies, I mean, there's consequences for that. But yeah, so
You lose your audience.
you could lose your audience, right? You lose credibility. But yeah, if you watch different news networks, you will notice the theatrics of it. And what I mean by that is a lot of yelling, especially when it's like editorial type shows, where they're, it's not really like a 6 p.m. evening news type of show where it's really just one person and they have their own show and they're interviewing. Usually that person is argumentative, that gets someone on that completely disagrees with them. So they know there's going to be a fight. I mean, they're just waiting for it. And you have constant bickering back and forth, right? And so it kind of creates the theater of it all. It makes it look like the two issues are very divided. However, that might not be the case. The issues might be more gray. There might be a lot more gray area than there is black and white. And you'll notice it, again, I hate to pick on Fox News, but you'll notice with Bill O'Reilly, and maybe not just Bill O'Reilly, I think CNN does it too sometimes, and it always gets me, what bothers me the most is that they'll say things like, all right, answer yes or no, do you think the war in Iraq was a good idea?
What?
Yes.
Yes or no? And it's like, well, is it really that clear? There's some good parts of it. Maybe there's some bad parts to it. Why is everything a yes or no answer, right? And that's because they're trying to simplify everything, which is again trying to keep your attention, but at the same time can be a bit misleading. All right, let's move on here. So those are like the basic 4 criteria to understand how a news network is biased, or if you're going to measure it. But it's a particular slant, right? It's a particular sort of narrative about a subject. An ideology, it's a little bit different. I mean, it's similar, but an ideology is a shared beliefs among a group of people. I mean, that's a textbook definition. An ideology would be, for example, conservatism is an ideology. Okay? Liberalism is an ideology. These are, there's a set core beliefs of each ideology that people who call themselves or label themselves as such tend to follow. For example, a conservative ideology tends to promote things like, laissez-faire economics, tends to promote, traditional culture, right? So they would be very much against gay marriage, for example. They tend to be, in the United States, more religious, okay? And that's generally they're against corporate taxes. They believe in trickle-down economics. All right, and they all seem to follow the same belief system. So if you say you're conservative, it means something. Right? So that's an ideology. It's a group of ideas, not just one. Right? Liberalism is quite different. Liberalism, you talk more about, as opposed to individual rights, you tend to focus more on the collective good, or what they call it, the common good. You believe in things like the redistribution of wealth, higher taxes, but you're more open in terms of culture, right? So marijuana legalization wouldn't be a problem for liberals, but it could be a problem it is a problem for most conservatives. Right, so it's a group of beliefs. Now, each news station that you are assigned has a particular ideological slant. And it's up to you to figure that out, but I think it would be fairly obvious. But keep in mind, okay, your slant depends, the slant depends on where you stand on the political spectrum. All right, so if you're, this is the political spectrum. All right, so we have left, right, all right, we have authoritarianism and anarchy.
Libertarian.
Okay, or libertarianism. Okay, so you have left, right, anarchy, authoritarianism. Okay, how biased a particular station is depends where you stand. So, like for example, this textbook or the handout you have criticizes the media for being too liberal, having way too much of a liberal bias. Now, if you think the media is liberal, so let's say here, I think the media is here, and where do you think you stand then? If you think that the media has a liberal bias, are you more likely to be liberal or conservative?
Conservative.
Okay, you're more likely to be here. You. All right, or let's just say viewer. And that also goes the other way around. If you're on the left side of the political spectrum, if the viewer is here, right, you're going to see the media as being right-wing or conservative. And let me give you an example of how this works. So people on the left, on the extreme left, tend to criticize the media as being completely conservative and right-wing. And you're thinking, now how is that possible if people on the right think the media is too liberal and too left-wing? Well, it depends on what you look at and what you define as critical analysis. So people on the left, or left-wing scholars, particularly Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, they often criticize the media because whenever they look at a problem, they never look at capitalism as being the problem itself. Right? So capitalism itself is never the problem. And it can never be the problem under mainstream media because the people who pay for that media to actually exist are corporations, right? These are companies that make lots of money. So it is impossible with this type of system to have a truly critical media that is entirely separate and independent from the status quo. It is part of the status quo. It is part of the machine. It legitimizes, capitalism, right? It might criticize some of the, policies surrounding capitalism. Should we regulate or deregulate? But you will never find a mainstream station that will say capitalism is the root of
All evil.
not all evil, but the root of the crisis, right? So people on the left tend to argue that. Now, people on the right, well, they say, well, the media is completely biased from a liberal perspective. It's completely has a complete liberal bias, and that's very evident because everything is so politically correct on the media, right? Everything is so PC, right? You can't criticize openly on TV homosexuality. You can't without being completely slandered and completely ridiculed on the media the next day. If, for example, if you look at extreme right-wing pundits like Rush Limbaugh, for example, he's an extreme right-wing political pundit in the United States. He just got in trouble because last week he kind of, I didn't see it so I can't say what he did, but he kind of made an offensive comment to the transgendered community. All right? And he didn't, okay, I don't want to say what he said wasn't that bad, but it wouldn't seem all that offensive because it wasn't all that derogatory. But anyway, he used the word tranny, okay, to refer to transgendered individuals, and he got completely ridiculed the next day. So there is no freedom of speech. Everything has to be so politically correct that people who have traditional values are completely censored. Right? So there is a huge liberal bias in the media. That's from the conservative standpoint. So as you can see, where you stand on the political spectrum depends on how you view the media's bias. Right? So if you tend to think the media has a liberal bias, perhaps you're more on the conservative side. Right?
Vice versa.
Vice versa. Cool?
Yep.
All right. Last thing I wanted to mention then today is go through the article is understand media biases, biases in the media. At least go through some of it. And I gave you an article. We won't read through all of it, but at least the first few paragraphs. And this comes from a textbook that espouses a theory known as elite theory, which arguably is very left or very right. I mean, personally, I think it's both. But you'll see what I mean, and we'll go through it. So I gave you, was it 2 pages?
Yep.
All right, we won't go through all, I won't go through both of them, but just the first few paragraphs. So it says bias in television news, and I'll read the first paragraph and then ask someone to read the next one. So starting from here, bias in the television news, starting from here. Overall, network television, through entertainment, newscasts, and news specials, communicates established liberal elite values to the masses. For many years, the media elite was united in its liberal views. So you can see it's criticizing the media for being too liberal. The major television networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, the leading influential newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, and the national news magazines, Newsweek, Time, all reflected the prevailing liberal bias. So the argument actually from the right, and even from this perspective, is that actually if you look at most of the media, it's largely liberal, right? And that's because if they say anything that's very conservative, usually there's backlash. These are the values of the media elite: liberal reform and social welfare, a focus on the problems of minorities and the poor, skepticism toward organized religion and the traditional family, suspicion of business, hostility toward the military, and an urge to use government power to do good. The liberal bias of the news originates in the values of the newsmakers. The owners, stockholders of the major corporations that own the television networks, magazines, and newspaper chains tend to share the moderate conservatism and republicanism of the business community, but the producers, directors, and reporters are clearly left-leaning and democratic in their political views. Interesting. Elite national newsrooms are populated by liberals more than our local newsrooms. Among national media people, self-described liberals outnumber conservatives 5-1. Although many describe themselves as moderates, even they are decidedly more liberal in their views than moderates in the general public. See table 5.2. All right, who would like to read the next paragraph? Okay, Jihoon in the back.
Conservatives often complain but largely fail to crack the liberal media monopoly, even though polls show 40% of the people in the United States self-identify as conservative. This audience had no choice but to watch liberal content and complain about the bias in the mainstream media. The 1996 arrival of the Fox television network introduced ideological diversity to television by bringing conservative news reports and commentators to TV viewers.
Okay, so we were talking about the positive side of being biased is that it does contribute to ideological diversity. I mean, if you don't like Fox News, you don't have to watch it. All right, next paragraph. Aaron.
Billionaire Rupert
Murdoch.
broke the liberal monopoly on the news when he recognized an unfilled market for conservative views on television in the United States. The Fox network slogan is fair and balanced news. We report, you decide. The implication is that Fox is rectifying the liberal bias of the mainstream media. If its reporting is a pure conservative, the reason is that the country has become so accustomed to left-leaning media that a truly balanced network only seems conservative. In fact, regular news reporting on Fox is not much different from that of other networks. It is a toxic commentary shows that outrage liberals and warm the hearts of conservatives. But whatever its flaws, Fox News has added a diversity of views to U.S. television. Conservatism also prevails on talk radio, both among mass callers and hosts such as Rush Limbaugh, who garners the highest rating on talk radio. Liberal views will still dominate the vast majority of the broadcast and cable news programs. The left is also more pronounced on public radio and television, which receive government subsidies to present material to their audiences.
Okay, good. Next paragraph. Miss Emily.
In the fall of 2009, Fox News found itself with targeted attacks from the Obama White House, which held that its conservative perspective made it an outlet of the Republican Party rather than the news organization. In September, Fox was excluded from the series of presidential interviews on healthcare reform. In October, Fox was blocked from participating in press events with the administration's new Pay-Czar move that led the other news networks to refuse to participate unless their colleagues from Fox were present. Fox had run several stories damaging to the Obama White House, including exposés of administration officials and of Acorn, a controversial nonprofit group with links to administration.
Okay, we can just end it there because the next paragraph just concludes. But as you can see, the last paragraph we just read outlines how a particular party can clash with a particular news station, right? So the emergence of Fox News has created a huge spur of criticism among sort of liberal stations. And they often will reference each other and argue with each other, even though they're on totally different networks. Good?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, last thing I want to say, sort of bring this all together, is that, I mean, the reason why we're doing this in this class, Understanding Media Bias, is not purely just for you to understand what a bias is, but actually the point is to help you make better choices when you actually get a chance to vote. So when do you get to vote? 2 years?
Next year.
Next year, right? So next year, as you're voting, you're going to have to filter through a lot of information, right, that's going to be thrown at you, which can be very confusing. So one of the key tools that you need to learn is how to separate fact from opinion. Right? And it might seem easy in some cases, but in other cases it's not, especially when we talk about selective information. Right? So when you're doing your media project, when you're looking at the news, it might help you to look how other news networks focus on the same story to see what information was being left out. Right? And all of this contributes to better citizenship. Okay? Because if you can vote better, if you're more informed, you're more likely to create a better outcome in terms of the election. That's it. Yep. We're done. Okay, thank you. So next period, you'll split up into groups, and we'll start the group project, and I'll walk around with you.
Break. I don't know.
Yes, we have a break. Oh my god.
Why?
I can't stop recording it. It's recording forever.
Just press the red button.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you use the different ones. Yeah, of course. Yeah, everything's connected. Sure. Yeah.
That's the mic.
What are you doing?
Where's the cursor?
Maybe it's not on the screen.
This one, wait.
Move it.
I think you're using the wrong mouse.
You're not